All right, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Brian J. Griffith. I'm an assistant professor of European history at California State University, Fresno, and I'll be your host for today's Fresno State History Department book talk with Dr. Lisa Jacobson, who I will be officially introducing in just a moment. But first, I'd like to go over some basics on how this meeting will be structured. Following my brief professional introduction, Dr. Jacobson will deliver a 40 to 45-minute presentation on her new monograph, Intoxicating Pleasures, which will be followed by a Q&A session during the time that remains in our meeting. If you have a question that you would like to ask during our Q&A session, you have two different options. The first is you can write your question into the Q&A dialog at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and I will read it aloud for you during the discussion portion of today's session. Or you can raise your hand or use the chat dialog to indicate your desire to speak yourself via your microphone and/or your camera, and I will call upon you in the proper order. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lisa Jacobson. Dr. Jacobson is an associate professor of the late 19th and 20th century United States at University of California, Santa Barbara. Lisa is a cultural historian with wide-ranging interests in the history of consumer culture, food and alcoholic beverages, capitalism and the senses, and childhood, gender, and the family. Dr. Jacobson offers a broad array of interdisciplinary courses at UC Santa Barbara, including 20th century American history, food and world history, and the methods and theories of oral history, to name just a few of her regular offerings. Lisa's work has been supported by a number of prestigious research grants and fellowships, such as those offered by the UC Humanities Network and the Mellon Foundation, UCSB's Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, the Hagley Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and Duke University's Hartman Center, and many more. Dr. Jacobson is the author of numerous articles and book chapters and monographs on American history, including Raising Consumers, Children and the American Mass Market in the Early 20th Century, published by Columbia University Press in 2004, Beer Goes to War, The Politics of Beer Promotion and the Production in the Second World War, published by Food, Culture, and Society in September 2009, Will It Be Wine or Cocktails? The Quest to Build a Mass Market for California Wine After Prohibition, published in Enterprise and Society in June of 2017, and the edited volume, Capitalism's Hidden Worlds, co-edited with Ken Lipartito, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020. In addition to these, Dr. Jacobson is the author of the subject of today's virtual meeting, Intoxicating Pleasures, Reinventing Wine, Beer, and Whiskey After Prohibition, published by University of California Press in 2024. If you would like to purchase a hardback copy of Intoxicating Pleasures, you can do so via the following URL and 30% off discount code, which brings the grand total to purchasing a fresh copy of this monograph to only $20, which is a very reasonable price for an academic press book. Before I hand the reins over to Dr. Jacobson, let me just say how much of a pleasure it is for me to be hosting this particular book talk. Lisa, as some of you will know, was on my PhD exams and dissertation committees when I was a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara, and was responsible for the shaping of my research on winemaking under Benito Mussolini's dictatorship, in particular, her article, Beer Goes to War, which fundamentally transformed some of the questions that I was asking and research methodologies that I was experimenting with. So it is such an honor to be able to support Dr. Jacobson's research in turn by hosting today's virtual presentation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Jacobson.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to have a colleague in Brian who studies the Italian wine industry in a very similar period, and I've benefited from his interpretive insights, and he's also very generous in sharing his great finds in the Italian archives with me. And I want to also thank those of you on the Zoom for making some time in your day to hear about my book. Now, when I started researching this book, I set out to answer a deceptively simple question. How did alcoholic beverages, these substances once banned under Prohibition, shed their stigmatized pasts and become emblems of the good life? We've long operated on the assumption that the answer to this question is fairly straightforward. And this brings me to some of the myths that my book puts to rest. The first myth is that it's often assumed that because frustration with repeal was so widespread, because the law was so widely flouted, that the repeal of prohibition itself in 1933 was evidence of alcohol's mainstream acceptance. And if you look at the images on the screen here, the Thin Man film that kind of glamorizes drinking comes right out of the gate in 1934. The images of, bargoers jubilantly celebrating prohibition's repeal, you get a sense of how that popular interpretation became so deeply embedded in historical memory. But, historians have also done their part to sort of further this myth. Some really stress this idea that alcohol's rise to respectability was almost effortless. And so you have this common understanding that repeal represented the triumph of cultural liberalism over Victorian Puritanism. But in reality, repeal was far more constrained and modest. And that was recognized early on by, Edward Bernays, who understood that repeal didn't suddenly wash away all of the stigmas that had justified alcohol's prohibition. He was hired in the late 1930s by a leading brewers trade association, and after surveying, public opinion, he delivered the bad news, which was, well, repeal wasn't a get out of jail free card. In the eyes of many voters, alcohol was still on probation. And in fact, when the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition returns alcohol regulation to the states in 1933, vast swaths of the country, something on the order of 1 in 6 Americans, continued to live under some alcohol ban. Many of the new alcohol regulations treated alcoholic beverages and drinkers themselves as morally suspect. And the industry itself still had an unsavory reputation as alcohol traffickers or merchants of booze. Complicating matters further, wine, beer, and whiskey each faced distinctive marketing and regulatory challenges. Beer and whiskey had to be redeemed from the disrepute of the saloon. Wine had to be rescued from its foreign associations with immigrant drinking traditions on the one hand and elite connoisseurship on the other. Trade barriers that kept liquor out of restaurants and kept wine and beer off grocery stores had to be lifted. And none of this could be accomplished without winning women, the former foot soldiers of the Prohibition movement, to the industry's side. The second myth that my book seeks to debunk is this idea that Prohibition's repeal ushered alcohol off the political stage as the federal government turned its attention to the Great Depression and World War II. And as you can see from this lead article in a 1942 issue of Modern Brewery Age, alcohol is still highly politicized, and the trade journal is sort of sounding the alarm that there is a prohibitionist resurgence afoot in World War II. So rather than depoliticizing alcohol, industry trade associations actually turned both of these national crises, the Great Depression and World War II, to their advantage. And they weren't doing this alone. They were working with a network of publicists and advertisers, New Deal policymakers, home economists, cookbook authors, other kinds of tastemakers. And together they transformed alcohol from a transgressive vice into an ordinary, respectable pleasure. So, how did they do all of this? The first step was to identify and confront obstacles. If you were a vintner or a brewer or a self-appointed drinking reformer, your larger ambition was to wean Americans from whiskey and from their cocktail loving ways. Vintners and brewers advocate regulations that are designed to steer people toward wine and beer rather than whiskey. And they have support in that effort from scientists and physicians who testify at congressional hearings that beer and wine, if they're used as they're supposed to be used, in keeping with the model of the family-friendly German beer garden, or in the French and Italian tradition of drinking wine with meals, beer and wine could set Americans on a better path. And so the idea here was that if you consume wine and beer in moderation, um, in the company of friends, and better yet, in the civilizing presence of women, um, these could be, salubrious pleasures. And they kind of scapegoat whiskey. They say whiskey is the real alcohol troublemaker. That makes you an angry drunk. Now, they also have support in this coming from key figures in the Roosevelt administration, like Rex Tugwell, who's a member of FDR's Brain Trust. He's the assistant Secretary of Agriculture. And he has this vision that's actually shared by the head of the Federal Alcohol Administration of transforming the United States into a temperate republic of wine and beer drinkers. And Tugwell gives this speech to the National Women's Democratic Club, in which he says, essentially, women, it's up to you to make repeal work. It's up to you to make a virtue of moderate drinking. And he urges women to accompany their husbands to beer gardens, to serve wine with dinner at home. You also had another group of self-appointed drinking reformers who were publishing drinking etiquette guidebooks. And one of those was Alma Whitaker, who was a columnist for the LA Times. She appointed herself the Emily Post of refined drinking and wrote this book, Bacchus Behave, The Lost Art of Polite Drinking, in which she's also calling upon women to enforce the new rules of righteous drinking in their capacity as hostesses. So she says, instead of humoring the drunk, make vulgar excess taboo. And if you think about her advice, it's really quite a contrast to the kind of exuberant, almost chaotic cocktail parties that you see in a movie like The Thin Man. Now, distillers are not about to cede the mantle of moderation to brewers and winemakers. And Seagram, leading whiskey maker, launches its own moderation campaign with a view to teaching consumers how to drink responsibly. And their key message is, do your best to avoid that one drink too many. Pay your bills first. Sip and savor your whiskey, don't guzzle it. And if you look at these two ads, what I find fascinating about them is the way that Seagram is essentially co-opting the rhetoric of their prohibitionist opponents. So this image on the left, we don't want bread money, it sort of has echoes of temperance imagery of the forlorn housewife who is condemned to poverty by a husband who squandered his earnings at the saloon. And the reference to bread money, in some ad readers' minds might have evoked blood money, suggesting that buying whiskey before necessities was a betrayal of one's honor and a man's breadwinning obligations. So Seagram's own vision of the ideal drinker, this affluent, financially solvent breadwinner, actually echoed the thinking of contemporary experts in alcoholism who really thought the problem drinker was the person who failed to fulfill his breadwinning responsibilities. Another big obstacle was the economic and sensory legacies of prohibition. So, there's not a lot of aged whiskey and aged wine on hand. So a lot of the early product that comes on the market doesn't taste good. And you can see this Calvert whiskey ad kind of acknowledge that, saying, tired of whiskey that tastes harsh and scratchy as barbed wire. So this very evocative image of a whiskey glass with a twist of barbed wire kind of gets at the idea that a lot of the early production tasted little better than whiskey hot off the still. The more troubling, I think, legacies were the sensory legacies of prohibition, because you had these really unexpected shifts in consumer tastes. Before prohibition, Americans liked dry table wines, they liked really hoppy beers, but those weren't selling well at all after. And part of the reason was that prohibition itself had accustomed consumers to prefer alcohol that was sweeter and alcohol that was much more potent. So, some of the beverages that sell really well in Prohibition are things like Coca-Cola and orange juice, and some might be buying them as alternatives to alcohol, but others are using them as mixers to mask the bad taste of bootleg liquor. The exemptions in the Volstead Act for sacramental wine and homemade wine also conditioned consumer taste. So there's this very strange section of the Volstead Act that many residents in immigrant neighborhoods and some middle-class suburbs as well take advantage of. And that's this section that says you can produce up to 200 gallons of non-intoxicating fruit juice. And you can do that every year as long as it's exclusively for home use. Now, that amounts to, something on the order of 3 bottles of wine per day. So you can imagine a lot of that is entering bootleg channels. Now, the marketers of the grape juice and this product called a grape brick, which was essentially concentrated grapes to which you could add some water. You see the grape brick on the right of your screen. They're marketing this with a wink and a nod, saying, yeah, add some plain water and you'll get something that tastes like sherry or Zinfandel or Muscatel. But the wink and the nod comes with the instruction, be sure you don't place this in a dark cupboard, because then it would turn to wine. Now, during Prohibition, there were a lot of people who ventured into Little Italy's to enjoy some wine with their Italian food, which they, sipped surreptitiously from coffee cups. Some people developed a taste for it, but many people, found that wine, most of it homemade, really harsh and strong. And that made wine harder to sell after Prohibition. Another obstacle are the alcohol control regulations, which vary widely from state to state, from county to county. Most states and counties have local optional laws, which allow voters to decide whether their county will remain wet or dry in elections every year, every other year. And on the whole, the new alcohol control regulations did not represent a triumph of permissive norms. On the contrary, in New Mexico, drinkers had to be licensed, and liquor stores kept records of their purchases. The selective enforcement of alcohol bans that had been a hallmark during Prohibition actually intensified after the repeal of Prohibition, because now state liquor authorities, using these very vaguely worded disorderly conduct statutes, are using them to shut down gay and lesbian bars, to shut down Black-owned bars, or penalize bars that attracted Black and white patrons. In the 17 control states, you had laws that essentially permitted spirits and wine and stronger beers to be sold only from a state-run store. And the idea here was that the state-run store was both the wholesaler and the retailer, and they wanted to sort of remove the profit motive from selling alcohol. So these places were hard to find. There was no advertising on the exterior, very little signage. And if you look at this photograph of the interior of a state-run store in West Virginia, you can see just how plain and uninviting these stores were, deliberately so. There was, no advertising. The clerks were unfriendly. And in a merchandising culture that was otherwise suffused with color and advertising everywhere, I think these very plain state-run liquor stores sent a very clear message that alcohol was not respectable. The other obstacle were the competitive rivalries and internal industry divisions, which hindered collective action in the face of, say, prohibitionist resurgence. So you had competitive rivalries between distillers who specialized in straight whiskey and those who specialized in blended whiskey. You had divisions between brewers who sold most of their production nationally through bottles destined for home consumption, and then the brewers who sold most of their production, regional breweries destined for sale in taverns on tap. And then you had divisions between winemakers who saw the future was in table wine, in getting Americans to enjoy wine with their meals, and then other winemakers who catered primarily to the market in really much stronger fortified wines of 18 to 20%. And then you had those in the industry who really weren't interested in winemaking at all, but saw wine as the outlet for their surplus raisin and table grapes. And when those got mixed into the crushers, as they often did in the 1930s, the wine was fairly mediocre. So part of the story that I tell is how these industries came to see themselves as a coherent industry. And here's where the trade associations come in. They have to convince alcohol producers that prohibitionists are still a threat. They have to convince them that they have a common interest in advertising the product rather than a brand. And they have to convince them that it's worth the extra money to pay for a collective advertising campaign. A turning point for the California wine industry was the moment when they learned to call themselves wine growers instead of wine manufacturers. And this was a semantic innovation that allowed them to qualify for a marketing order that was directed by the California State Department of Agriculture. They had to convince the Department of Agriculture that wine was indeed an agricultural product. And the advantage of being able to participate in the marketing order was that it would compel everyone to pitch in for collective advertising once 2/3 of the industry had signed on. So this was a way of getting around that free rider problem. So when a lawyer for the Wine Institute, this trade association, says, look, you should all start calling yourselves wine growers, he was kind of greeted with howls of laughter. They said, we don't see any of this wine growing out of the ground. But that semantic innovation paid huge dividends. As wine growers, vintners could claim the virtue attributed to gentlemen farmers, and they could shed the industry's image as merchants of booze. Redeeming and reinventing alcohol was a messy and complicated process. And industry trade associations made a few missteps along the way. So let's take a look at a couple of those. The first misstep was the revival of the beer as liquid bread argument. So Edward Bernays develops this campaign for the One Brewers, trade association in the late 1930s, and the main target is housewives and rural voters who are very likely to vote dry in a local option election. Women are a doubly important target because women are often the ones who decide how much and what kind of alcohol enters the home. So the campaign promotes beer as a food and a source of culinary adventure, with the idea of getting people to see beer not as an intoxicating beverage, but as a liquid food that belonged on the pantry shelves along with other household staples. Now, if you look at this advertisement above, the horizontal one, which ran on the sides of buses and trolley cars, it's really making this point that, the beer industry is helping out farmers. Beer is nature's liquid food. And what I like about this is the way the visuals sort of complete the metaphor of beer as liquid bread. So you see these cinched stacks of barley with the very fluffy tops, and that kind of mirrors the tapered Pilsner glass of beer with the very foamy head of beer on it. Now, the liquid bread concept was sort of very familiar and uncontroversial to the German Americans and their immigrants and their descendants who dominated the beer industry. But the decision to revive the liquid beer argument was both, risky and surprising. In part because they tried the argument before and it basically had backfired. Consider this trade card advertisement that one brewer created in 1883 to advance the anti-prohibitionist cause. So you've got this beautiful color lithograph, the babe decked out in patriotic red, white, and blue, seated in a high chair with a mug of beer in hand, and the accompanying jingle leaves little doubt about the source of the babe's cheerful disposition, the youngster, ruddy with good cheer, serenely sips his lager beer. But despite the obvious political risks of the liquid beer argument, the brewers go ahead with it. There's controversy. Not everybody is on board with it in the industry. The other thing that Bernays does is hires home economists to create recipe books. So he wants to promote beer cookery as well. And the recipe booklets come up with, some classic beer-based recipes for beer bread and beer cheese sauces, some really sweet dishes like chocolate beer cake, and a few oddball ones like melon balls and beer dressing, which was basically called for dousing melon balls in a cup of beer and letting it rest in the refrigerator. It might not surprise you that reviews of It's Smart to Serve Beer were not always kind. One newspaper editorial, fearing that the beer makers' press agents have been sampling something stronger than the mild amber fluid, hoped, for the sake of peace and quiet at dinner time, that melon balls with beer, sweet potatoes and beer, and beer cabbage slaw would remain uncooked and unsampled. The second misstep was, the danger of overemphasizing wine's respectability. So wine had a different set of hurdles to overcome. It was viewed as both too highbrow and too lowbrow. And so one of the things that advertising agencies had to figure out is how to divorce wine both from its lower class associations with immigrants and drunken derelicts and from its upper class associations with fussy etiquette. Hyping wine's respectability seemed like the obvious choice. And J. Walter Thompson, the agency that handled the wine industry's account, recruited an impressive roster of celebrity endorsers. So you can see ads with John Steinbeck and Norman Rockwell, the actress Lynn Fontaine, Ty Cobb, wives of famous actors. So here, Mrs. Basil Rathbone in this ad. And you can see from the text of this ad that they're really leaning into the idea of wine as a beverage of moderation. So many now prefer a moderate evening, one in it that goes with gracious, unhurried living. And there's a bit of instruction in the ad. People don't want to bolt down wine. So the text of the ad successfully positions wine as a beverage of moderation, but the accompanying image, this really elegantly appointed table, the guests who are dressed to the nines, to say nothing of the maid who's serving the wine, all of that really reinforced wine's associations with luxurious living. Perhaps not the best tack when the country was still mired in the Great Depression. Now, a celebrity endorser like Ty Cobb, on the other hand, had the potential to simultaneously elevate and democratize wine. The baseball legend was better known for his hot temper and aggressive playing style, his profanity, but as a wine pitchman, he exuded cosmopolitan sophistication, and he leans into this idea of wine as the beverage of moderation again, stressing that this is the preferred beverage of the best known, busiest people. Busiest is saying this is for people who know how to drink moderately so they can continue their lives without a hangover the next day. Now, the wine-loving Cobb may have struck some ad readers as a genteel pretender. Others may have concluded that wine could confer respectability on the unlikeliest of suspects. But the choice of such a masculine spokesman to sell California sherry, which was a drink more commonly associated with feminine tastes, was likely no accident. One of the central arguments of my book is that the most transformational moments in alcohol's reinvention was not repeal, but World War II. On the home front and the battlefront, the war changed the war changed attitudes toward alcohol for decades to come. And in the face of a reinvigorated prohibitionist opponent, brewers and winemakers and distillers all learned to become savvy practitioners of the politics of pleasure. So the war is this moment of peril and opportunity because it revives the industry's biggest political foe. Prohibitionists, recalling that in World War I, they had gotten prohibition through, see this moment, World War II, as their opportunity to stage a political comeback. And they, mobilize, in voters in Protestant churches, in Baptist and Methodist churches. They, file petitions, flood Congress with petitions, making a series of demands for emergency wartime prohibitions. And they're basically reviving the same playbook they had in World War II. One of their biggest demands is to ban alcohol from Army training camps and a 10-mile radius around them. The idea, we've got to have a disciplined fighting force. And when you think about the 10-mile radius, that's pretty big. It's clear that they also want to control civilians as well. The Secretary of War, military officials, Congress kind of rejects the bill or fails, but prohibitionists don't let it go. They keep introducing this bill year after year after year. The military's position is we're better off giving, enlisted men at least something mild like 3.2% beer. And so that, it's good for their morale, but that would steer them away from the stronger stuff. The other argument that they have, which they're again reviving from World War I, is that we should ban alcohol production as a food conservation measure. And this argument was a potentially potent one because the US government in World War II had already mandated rationing of scarce foods like meat and sugar, butter, coffee, and they developed a pretty elaborate campaign around this concept of food fights for freedom, in which they're encouraging Americans to ration food, to conserve, food, don't waste it, use your leftovers, so that there will be enough food for the troops, for US allies, and for the peoples who are liberated from fascist occupation. So brewers and vintners essentially fend off these prohibitionist attacks by casting wine and beer as patriotic pleasures that would advance the war effort, not hinder it. Let's take a look at the brewing industry's Morale is a Lot of Little Things campaign. These ads celebrate the right to enjoy a refreshing glass of beer after a good day's work and depict beer as one of the little things that help to lift spirits, keep up the courage. So there's several interesting things going on here. First, there's this implicit argument, lean into the phrase after a good day's work. There's this implicit argument. Beer isn't going to create slackers, as prohibitionists might imagine, but beer actually rewards those who are doing vital defense work. And it's just compensation. that enjoying simple pleasures is not going to interfere with honoring wartime calls for sacrifice. Um, the other thing to notice is this rights-based discourse, and that becomes very prominent in a number of places during World War II. This rights-based discourse had been very submerged. You could find it, but it was very submerged in the campaign to repeal prohibition. World War II is bringing it to the fore. The other thing to notice in these ads is that beer isn't all that prominently featured, but by likening beer to other simple pleasures like, you know, getting a new hairdo or carving a pumpkin or lounging in a hammock, the ads are essentially placing beer on the same moral plane as these other pleasures. Note also, if you look at the bottom left corner of the first two ads, you'll see that these ads are featuring letters from homesick GIs recalling the things that they missed most about home, hinting that beer is an essential part of the good life that they are fighting to defend. Another part of the beer industry's campaign was the Beer Belongs campaign. Here again, you see the revival of this rights discourse. Beer belongs in this America of tolerance and neighborliness. It's part of the American heritage of personal freedom. Implicitly in this, there is, you know, an argument that, you know, this beer and the values it represents, tolerance, cultural pluralism, liberty, contrast with the fascist enemy. And the brewers actually make that argument quite explicitly in some other ads. The other thing to notice about these is, well, where does beer belong? It belongs in these wholesome and most iconic of American settings: the community roof raising, the Western barbecue, the Boston Pops concert. And particularly in the first image of the community roof raising, I think what you see here is the brewers tapping into this wartime nostalgia for small town life, where extended families and communities symbolized the kind of stability that many Americans yearned for amid all of these family separations and wartime disruptions. The first and the third ad also, and to lesser extent the middle ad, also highlight beer in heterosocial settings. And I think what that does is part of the work of distancing beer from the raucous masculinity of the saloon. Now, Brewer's most innovative response to prohibitionist critics was to align beer with the Food Fights for Freedom campaign. And they do that by highlighting that one of the byproducts of brewing is brewer's yeast, which is a terrific source of vitamin B, one of the most celebrated vitamins of the war because it boosted moods and was said to be able to boost productivity. And so brewer's yeast, you know, the argument was this gets into livestock feed. It can be added to the soups and donuts that are served, you know, at lunch to defense workers. They even very late in the war get it added to army biscuits. And so this is a very clever and compelling response to the prohibitionist charge that brewing wasted vital foodstuffs. On the contrary, they're saying brewers are actually ingenious recyclers who are making every grain count. The California wine industry also aligns itself with the Food Fights for Freedom campaign. And basically, you see them promoting wine as the secret ingredient that can turn wartime dishes into food for kings. So you can add it to a stew and tenderize a cheap cut of meat, the only cut you were able to find in the market. Or you could use it to enliven leftovers, or you could turn organ meats like this oxtail stew on the left, and other less familiar proteins, like maybe the kidney bean casserole that you see on the right bottom, into something that's suitable for company fare. And of course, the argument is, be sure to drink a glass of the wine that you cooked with. This is going to cheer up war-weary souls. And the idea is also that we understand that following all of these food rules and working with food shortages is kind of onerous. This is going to make compliance with those food controls easier. And you see, this idea it gets picked up by cookbook authors who devote sections to, wine based fruit desserts, or Esquire magazine, which is teaching men how to cook with food. Now, whiskey's story is more complicated, but it too becomes embroiled in battles over the right to intoxicating pleasures. Whiskey distillers halt their beverage production for the war because they've converted their facilities to make industrial alcohol, which is needed to make two crucial ingredients for waging total war: synthetic rubber and smokeless gunpowder. And as you can see from some of these images, you really need staggering amounts of it in order to outfit a tank and a plane with rubber. So distillers are hoping that their contributions to the war effort will burnish their image as patriotic. After all, they're making a cocktail for the Axis as one of their public relations publications notes. But what happens is you get these widespread whiskey shortages, and whiskey is now even more coveted during the war because people have money to spend, and they want to trade up from beer to whiskey. And those shortages really damage the industry's reputation. You get whiskey black markets, you get price control violations, liquor hijackings, bootlegging rings. Consumers really frustrated that the whiskey they find has been blended with inferior spirits so that it doesn't taste very good. And one of the responses is that other kinds of trade associations, tavern associations, restaurant associations, rally to the distillers' side, and they start lobbying the government for what they call a whiskey holiday, a liquor holiday, or a liquor furlough, and basically saying, hey, allow the distillers to have a break from war production so they can replenish their dwindling supplies of beverage alcohol. And what fascinates me about that campaign is the justification they use for it. They, again, invoke this rights-based discourse and say this is about the right to decent whiskey. The government, which is eager to get black markets and price control violations under control, does give the industry not one, but three whiskey holidays, which is far more than many other industries who had sought a reprieve from war production got. Whiskey was also the focal point of intense conflicts over inequitable access to alcohol in the US military. Enlisted men were limited to 3.2% beer, and they were quite resentful that the officer class could have access to a wide array of spirits. Black servicemen of all ranks protested the more limited supplies of alcohol that were in segregated facilities. And they also protested, sometimes waging boycotts or sit-ins, official policies that excluded them from the better restaurants, bars, and liquor stores, both at home and abroad. And you see this disenchantment appear all over the place. I found it in the gripe letters to Army newspapers, in memoirs and oral histories, and of course in Bill Malden's cartoons. And you see here enlisted men on their R&R trying to find a place to relax, but they're barred from the officers' club. I think the conflicts generated by whiskey scarcity reveal something profound about alcohol's changing place in American society. And that is that alcohol had become such an expected feature of the good life, such a potent symbol of belonging, that white enlisted men and Black servicemen of all ranks came to see access to intoxicating beverages as an entitlement of military service and citizenship. The process of alcohol's reinvention doesn't end with the war. It's this ongoing process. But what my book shows is that World War II went a long way toward redeeming moderate drinking as a respectable pleasure and establishing alcohol as as an emblem of the good life. And that by liberating alcohol from its previous associations with vice and corruption, now alcohol could take on new and varied meanings in subsequent generations. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobson, for that fascinating presentation. Just as a reminder for everyone, if you're interested in asking a question, you have two different options during this Q&A session. You can either type out your question into the chat dialog and just hit enter, and I will read those questions aloud on your behalf in the order in which I received them. Or you can indicate your desire to ask your own question just by writing the word stack or question in the chat dialog, and I'll also call upon you in the order in which I receive those requests. In the meantime, I'm going to remind everyone with this link and the discount code that you can purchase a copy of Intoxicating Pleasures from UC Press's website using this UCP Save 30 discount code, and the total should come out to close to $20. Not a bad price point for an academic press book. All right, so I have a range of my own questions, Lisa. I will hold back on them because I see that we already have one question requested. So again, anyone who's interested, just go ahead and start entering into the chat dialogue. And during the lulls and valleys, I'll ask my own questions. All right, so I'm going to start with Hunter Robertson.
Hi, so my question was regarding alcohol's, like how alcohol was viewed prior to Prohibition, because I know you talked about its reinvention after Prohibition, but I was kind of wondering what were those, or how did America feel about alcohol before Prohibition, so that I can kind of better understand its reinvention that you talked about in the explanation.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Hunter, for that. I mean, alcohol is viewed as, something that invites people to drink to excess, that, it will produce, it has its addictive qualities, that people, particularly working class men who go to the saloon, will squander their money there and further impoverish their families. Their deep concerns about alcohol and domestic violence. And prohibitionists don't really believe that drinking can be done in moderation. It all leads to this downward spiral that ultimately results in, poverty, ruin, and death. I mean, it's a grim picture. And I think one of the reasons why prohibitionists were able to win people who may not have despised alcohol per se to their side was because the saloon itself was a focal point of deep concern. The saloon was seen as a magnet for all other kinds of vice. So saloons, there were so many of them. They operated on very thin, profit margins. You could have in some towns a saloon on every corner. I have some photographs of, the city of Cincinnati with, one saloon after another, each offering, the free lunch. And so there's a sense that what saloon owners do is on these thin margins, they then invite in prostitution, they invite in gambling, that politicians are using the saloon as a site to round up voters. So again, a source of deep corruption, and that's what helps to create a broad coalition that includes people who despise alcohol, others who despise the saloon but feel drinking is fine for me but not thee. And then there are plenty of others who are deeply invested in eliminating alcohol as a form of social control, particularly in the South, to keep African Americans in line. So you have the phenomenon of the white drinking prohibitionist who enjoys alcohol but wants to control the drinking of Black consumers. So there are multiple motives that factor into the prohibitionist movement. And yeah, there's this sense that the industry itself is furthering corruption and vice.
Yeah, thank you for that reply. That was actually a perfect segue to our next question by Vicente Sanchez, who asks, what role did race play in ad marketing? Was there a difference in how and what they advertised for different groups? And were barley and grape farmers subsidized by the government to encourage the beer and wine industries?
Okay. Let me take the second part first. They're not barley growers are not subsidized. The kind of indirect subsidy, and it's not a subsidy, but there is a government favoring of the beer and the wine industry, which comes in the form of lower excise taxes on wine and beer. So the idea is to steer people towards the lower alcohol beverages. And part of this, especially during the Great Depression, is seen as having the other advantage of helping farmers who are plagued with oversupply of grains or grapes find a solution for it. So there is that. In terms of marketing on race, there's a lot of implicit messaging that's happening. You probably noticed that in the ads I showed you, the people who populate them are very white and very middle class. And this is in part an effort to kind of take these beverages that are associated with ethnic drinking traditions and whiten them in order to elevate their respectability. And, there is some effort to kind of play up, oh, there's some lovely, ethnic dishes, spaghetti and meat sauce. I don't know, it's not all that Italian, but originally. But anyway, there is some nod to that, but those ads are very white for a reason. And the industry doesn't really start to even contemplate targeting Black consumers directly, for example, until the 1950s. They do that very tentatively. So going after more targeted markets that are defined by ethnicity and race really is something that doesn't come into play until the 1960s, 70s, and beyond.
Great. All right. Our next question comes from Elizabeth Schmidt.
Hey Lisa.
Hey.
So you kind of hinted at gender a little bit when you were talking about the Ty
Mm.
Cobb ad, masculinity, and I was just kind of thinking about like masculinity's going through its own transformation in this period. So how is that reflected in like the reinvention of alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating to me, okay, there's several things happening. I mean, the brewers and the vintners are really seeing their opportunity with women. And so um, they are definitely trying to make alcohol more welcoming to women because they are the ones, they're essentially the gatekeepers who are going to decide what alcohol, how much of it gets into the home. They're trying to reframe alcohol as respectable by making it a piece of gracious living and home entertaining. The whiskey distillers take a different tack. And in part because whiskey is more potent, in part because whiskey always also already is deeply associated with masculinity. It is a man's drink. Um, they decide to sort of collectively, on a voluntary basis, not include representations of women in liquor advertising. So, and this is a ban that they keep in place until 1958, by which point they conclude, okay, well, whiskey's acceptable enough. We don't have to worry about antagonizing prohibitionists or women anymore. We can start including women in ads. But that means that they really lean into this masculine ideal of the, um, affluent, financially secure breadwinner. And they have, um, I mean, Calvert runs this very long running series of ads about whiskey and the man of distinction. So these are men of distinction who drink this. But there's a lot of sort of um, messaging directed at men saying that drink our brand of whiskey because it delivers a kind of softer landing. It's not going to give you a headache. It's not going to give you a hangover. And you can drink it without worrying about embarrassment. One, it's prestigious enough, but you're not going to get super drunk or have to pay the price the next day. So there's a lot of conversation in these ads about how choosing the right kind of whiskey is essential to protecting a man's professional reputation.
Interesting. Great. Next in line is Tara Kendall.
Hi, Lisa. This has been
Thank you.
super fascinating. And I don't know if you even have this answer. It was just something I was thinking about when you were talking about whiskey and wine, especially in sort of the kind of taking it back from that immigrant culture. Being here in California, I was thinking, is there any sort of, do you know anything about other types of alcohol? Like I would think in California, people would have more access to things like tequila.
Mm.
Is there a sort of reclaiming of that, or is that still in this sort of unrespectable, it's foreign, it's Mexican space?
Yeah, that's a great example. I, I'm not going to give you a deep answer on the tequila because I'm actually just beginning research on what
Oh,
happens to tequila after after the post-war years. But tequila isn't really in the picture until World War II. You've got all of these shortages of whiskey, and so tequila, comes in. And people sample it. It doesn't, take off until later. There is a little bit of it's a foreign, beverage. It doesn't have the same prestige as whiskey. People are buying alcohol, and it is in part a status thing that's factors into their preferences. But I think tequila is also has its own story of remaking what it means. And your other question was about, Californians and alcohol. I mean, California consumers were the pride and joy of the California wine industry because they drank way more of it than anyone anywhere else in the country. And part of the wine industry's campaign was to, especially during the Depression, buy Californian, buy American. And so buying California wine was sort of the patriotic thing that loyal Californians did. They got the Hollywood studios to eliminate a scene in a Western that featured people stomping on grapes. Don't do that. That will, only associate our product with, unsanitary production. So they did have these ins with other businesses in California, like Hollywood. And then after the war, one of the national campaigns that the California wine industry launches is to celebrate wine as the California way of living. And this is part of actually a populist pitch that wine goes with patio dining, the California way. It goes with informal foods like burgers on the barbecue, So California plays a role in this image of, sunny but informal California, which has some real appeal after the war gets connected to how it's sold.
Great, thank you. Next in line is Van Troy Tran.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Well, I have this question is that we usually have this idea that economically during the Prohibition years accelerated the concentration of capital in the brewing industry, and which led to the rise of the big brewing juggernauts, and thereby a certain standardization of taste through the selection of ingredients, the isolation of specific strains of yeast, and so on. And I was wondering how this compares to the world of wineries and distilleries. So do we observe comparable or similar processes of standardization at the post-Prohibition years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the things the wine industry, so the wine industry really does have different kinds of segments. And I mean, wine really over time is about heightening the differences of taste in wine. It's about emphasizing the varietal. This is a Chardonnay, it's grown in this field, this is a Cabernet. What's interesting about the wine makers in this time period is that they're still leaning into European place names. So they don't call it Cabernet. There aren't that many, Cabernet grapes being planted because it's very expensive to plant them. They don't yield as much volume. And until there's enough consumer demand for it, it's not worth the financial risk. So they're selling red wines as Burgundy. They're selling, white wines generically as Chablis, or, so there or sherry and port. I mean, they're really leaning into the European names. It takes a long time until, the 60s really, before they really lean very aggressively into varietals. Now, there are some people who, you know, wine reviewers today who play a big role in kind of rating wines on a point scale. And there's some arguments that these wine reviewers who award points are kind of cultivating a taste for wines that are what I call and other people call hedonistic fruit bombs. Those are the ones I particularly love, and that you kind of, but you know, the wine industry is all about microclimates and, you know, the soil from one region to the other. So I don't think, I think, you know, really paying attention to variety is more the aim of the wine industry.
Great. Well, thank you for that reply. I think we have time for just one last question, and I like to close these meetings with the same kind of question for all of the authors that I host, and that's an archival discovery question. So, as all archival researchers know, there's you know, a process that you go through to find documentation on your topic. You know, you bring in certain questions, you bring in certain assumptions to the archive, to the library when you're conducting research, but then you find something that you weren't expecting, right? You discover a file, you discover I don't know, a particular advertisement or a campaign of advertisements that really influences you to kind of rethink some of your core questions, and sometimes even the direction that the entire broader project is taking. And I just wonder, during the course of the research that you carried out for this book, did you have any you know, experiences like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting to be asked that question because this book has taken me so long to research. um, my mind is going to the last chapter that I researched, which was the one on the military. And, you know, I'm not a military historian, but I have to say this was the most fun chapter to research because I was going into these memoirs and oral histories and the gripe letters to the, you know, Yank magazine. And I think I was just surprised at how deep the resentment was, what a recurring theme. The resentment of the, you know, whiskey deprived or alcohol deprived GI was. I was actually expecting that. I went into my research expecting the story to be that the soldiers who went abroad to Europe brought back a taste for wine with them. And that there was this veteran-induced wine boom. That's what I was expecting to find. And in fact, what I discovered was, you know, yeah, there was the occasional alcohol windfall, but mostly, you know, there wasn't a lot of alcohol to be found. It had been ransacked already, looted. You know, maybe once they get further into Germany, there's some, but it was in very short supply, and that most of these veterans who returned with the same set of tastes and yearning for a good American whiskey.
All right, well, Dr. Jacobson, thank you so much for being a guest on the Fresno State History Department Book Talk series, and thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the great questions, too.